All right, so friends, we welcome you to our 35th online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. This time is called Being the Church, and it is sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I'm Jill Beverlin. I'm the National Coordinator of Coaching for the ELCA, and I'm one of your facilitators today. It's important for us as we begin to be reminded that this time is meant to be a safe and brave space for the people of our church to bring the truth of who they are and how they are doing in this time. These conversations are an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. Last week, we talked about being church out in the world and about being a good neighbor connected to our Growing Young initiative. This week, we continue the theme of being church beyond the walls and how we can authentically live into our call to be custodians of the gospel as we dive into the messy topic of preaching and politics in a polarized time. How's that for alliteration? Today, I'm channeling my inner Dr. Seuss. Today, our guest speaker is the Reverend Bridget Jones, current pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church in Superior, Wisconsin. We all know that God uses everything to equip us for what we are called to do in life. Bridget is no exception and brings many gifts to her role as pastor, including training and experience as an actuary, which has enabled her to learn how to navigate the waters of assessing and mitigating risks in preaching and leading ministry. Bridget, I bet many in our room today are as intrigued as I am to hear your story about the connection of two seemingly very disconnected professions and how God has used this to bring clarity and strength for you to be a leader in this constantly changing and challenging landscape. Bridget, welcome to our room.
Thank you so much. So I've got a PowerPoint for all of us that has kind of a reflection, and I guess, is this the point we just jump right in? Yeah, all right, here we go. Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really excited about this. I don't really get to talk about actuarial science a lot anymore. So here we go. Can we see the screen here? Perfect. All right. So as Jill said, I'm Pastor Bridget Jones. I'm currently the pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church up in Superior, Wisconsin. And so I know it's 39 degrees in San Antonio today, but yesterday we had a wind chill of 9. So it's winter up here. It might get up into the 40s, who knows? So I've always been a member of an ELCA congregation. I was baptized into one back in 1991. But there's a broad diversity of ELCA churches. As either a layperson, a minister in training, or a pastor, I've been part of congregations that are rural, urban, suburban, from northern Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast of Florida, with congregations that skew older and more conservative to younger and more liberal. And something that they all had in common was that there was room for everyone to grow in following Jesus. And so no matter what kind of congregation you have, if you get to the right issue, it's gonna be a polarized space. I also went to college to be an actuary, which for those of you who have not seen Along Came Polly, is someone who analyzes and manages risk. So even though my actuarial work experience was just one summer internship at Mutual of Omaha before I had a call to be a pastor, I found myself using some of that risk management to figure out how to preach things that I felt compelled to preach that I didn't think would go over very well. A couple things, I've left time for questions at the end. So feel free to jot something down by yourself or put it in the chat and we will get there. And 2, I think I should note this PowerPoint presentation is full of stock images of people rock climbing because that's something that makes me go like, ugh. I do not rock climb. It is not a hobby of mine, but it just looks like one of the most risky things I can think of. So we are going to start with a brief reflection from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, rise up. He is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. This is the gospel of the Lord. This has become one of my favorite passages, and I think one that fits us really well to kind of frame today, because you know just as well as me that in our quest to facilitate an interaction with Jesus, as we gather in our sanctuaries or on our Zoom meetings, or as we pre-record our services and prepare to preach, there are a lot of voices that are ordering us to be quiet. That could be parishioners or our council or society at large. And often to avoid these orders, I'll silence myself first. So as we come up this week on All Saints, I hope that we remember that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who call to us today. And they say to us, "Take courage, rise up, Jesus is calling you." And so we also can become brave and loud followers of Jesus. So first this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to risk analyzing and risk management, so we kind of have a common language, and then we'll apply it to preaching. I did go over this with some friends, so I've tried to cut out all the boring parts. So here we go. So at the most basic, risk is the possibility that something bad will happen. For example, you lose your handhold as you are climbing up the side of a cliff without a rope. Bad has a huge range of meaning. It could be inconvenient or unexpected, or it could mean you die. So some activities are riskier than others, and some people have a higher tolerance for risks than other people. But as humans, we are instinctively navigating risk all the time. Right now in this pandemic, we're doing a lot of risk calculation as we figure out how safe activities are. So why do we even take risks then, instead of just staying in our houses and being safe? One reason is that the risk just isn't serious enough to avoid. So you risk a paper cut every time you pick up a piece of paper, and that's not great, but it's not a big deal. You're not going to avoid picking up papers so you don't get a paper cut. Another reason we take risks is because they're unlikely to happen. So every time you walk outside, there is a risk that you could get struck in the head by a falling meteor. You know, it could happen. But that's so unlikely that none of us are saying, like, I refuse to walk outside. And finally, some people take risks because they believe they will pay off. So for me, even though getting injured from climbing has a huge impact and not a low probability, especially if you're doing it like this, people still do it for some reason. There's great views, they think it's fun, there's some adrenaline, probably. If people have insight about climbing, like, please let me know, I don't understand it. So in business, instead of just randomly making risky moves, companies try to manage their risk. So first they'll assess the risk to see what the risks are. They're usually financial, or it might be like PR related. And then they see what the probability of them occurring is, and they figure out what their risk tolerance is, how much risk they can handle. And then they look at the benefits to see what those are, how likely the benefits are, and what those benefits are worth to them. And then they have some options. The first option is avoiding risk. You can just stay the same. So in the pandemic, the lockdown is risk avoidance. It comes with some issues, but it's the safest option. You can also choose to mitigate risk, which just means, it's a fancy word, it just means lessening the risk. So you can either lessen the impact, or you can lessen the probability that it will occur. So wearing masks and social distancing are risk mitigation efforts. And finally, if you aren't avoiding risk, you're going to choose to bear the risk, whether or not you've mitigated it. So bearing risk looks like being aware of what the risk is and going forward anyway. And so that can look like someone meeting up with friends while wearing masks while they're outside, or it can also look like just going to a bar with a lot of people without wearing masks. So in both situations, people know the risks, or they think they do. One person has chosen to mitigate them, but they've both decided to bear the risk. So now that we've got the lingo down, let's apply it to preaching. So sometimes you've got a word that you feel like you really need to proclaim, but there's something holding you back. That's your instincts telling you that there's some sort of risk happening here. You know either that not everyone's going to agree with you, or maybe you know that a few people are going to vehemently disagree with you. Preaching or saying something feels risky. So here you can do some risk management so you know how to proceed. I'll put a little disclaimer here. I don't go through this whole process every time I make a decision. Sometimes you just go with your gut. But even if you just do this once to gain clarity, it's always helpful to have more information about yourself and about your congregation. So first, what are the risks? Are you going to get fired? Is that a real possibility? Will people leave? Are they the ones who contribute a lot? We know that ministry does not mean just appeasing the rich people in your congregation, but it's a different assessment if there's someone who contributes nothing versus someone who makes up half of your operating budget. Those are just two different risks here. Will you get in trouble with the denomination? Is what you want to say in conflict with your church's beliefs? Are there relationships that will be harmed? This is not a super fun exercise, you can imagine, but the more information you have, the better you can make a good assessment. You can look at the history of the congregation, kind of their golden calves, their touchy points. So at my congregation, I'm not really worried about getting fired. I don't think that's a risk here. My congregation, as far as I know, has never fired anyone. And I know that there's enough people who like me that even if some people would like to, they just don't have the votes. So that's good to have clarity around. So then you ask, once you know what the risks are, you can ask, what is the probability that they will occur? And so this is the time, if you're someone who just thinks over and over like, oh no, here's all the things that could happen. This is not a time to catastrophize. This is a time to rationally look at what is the probability here? If you have a good relationship with your congregation and most people are pretty reasonable, which most people are, then it's not likely that something catastrophic will happen after one contentious sermon. However, if your congregation has a history of volatile groups starting feuds, then you have a different calculation here. My congregation is pretty stable, so I'm not really worried about something like a schism. But people up here, Midwesterners, can be kind of passive aggressive, and people have left before. So it is a higher likelihood if I'm thinking someone might leave. It's happened before and it could happen again. So that's a higher probability. You can almost be guaranteed that some people will be uncomfortable if you start preaching something contentious. And that's something that you're going to have to grapple with. Finally, what is my risk tolerance? Different people are comfortable with different levels of risk. I mean, right? Some people really do like rock climbing, I guess. So what level of risk are you comfortable with? And this is a really important part of any discussion about risky preaching, because often there are people with a lot of privileges trying to tell everybody else what to do. So as a straight, white, cisgender woman with no dependents, who has some money in the bank and a dad who has already told me I could live with him, my risk analysis is going to be different than someone else who is often passed up for calls or is living paycheck to paycheck or just got their family settled in a new school district. So it's not so much, I guess I should say, not so much what kind of risk am I comfortable with, but what risk can I tolerate? So after you've thought long and hard about all the bad things that could happen if you proclaim a particular word, and before you decide like, ooh, better not, take an equal amount of time to assess all of the benefits. So ask yourself, why do you feel called to preach this risky sermon? or perhaps start a Bible study or make a statement? Will it lead to a transformation of your congregation to be more like the followers Jesus calls them to be? Will it help you live out your call as a minister? I know I did not sign up for ministry to maintain my congregation as it is and just write boring newsletters for the next 30 years, right? I followed this call to be a pastor because I've got things to say. I'm a Christian because someone showed me a vision of the kingdom of heaven that God is bringing to this earth and said, don't you want to be a part of that? And I said, I do. So sometimes it's a little harder to imagine the benefits because sometimes they're intangible, but sometimes they are so tangible and they're really important. So when I arrived at my congregation and preached that God loves everyone of all genders and all sexualities, that it's not a sin to be part of the LGBTQIA+ community, that was the first time that anyone in my congregation had heard that from this pulpit. And since then, I've had 2 people come out to me who are not out to the rest of the congregation. One who's not even out to their immediate family because they knew that I would welcome their whole selves. So these benefits are tangible and they are important. What is the probability that they might occur? So as much as it would be really cool to imagine it, one sermon is most likely not going to transform your entire congregation in one day. We know this, but it can make people begin to think in new ways. You can start something with a sermon. You can plant some seeds. It can signal that you're going in a new direction. Or, like we said before, this might be the first time that your congregation has heard this view. Some things I say make a difference here, especially because I'm the first female pastor that my church has ever had in over 125 years of ministry. So there are some things that I say that make a difference. And there's other issues that I won't be able to move them on with 100 sermons. So looking at what's the probability. And finally, what is this worth to me? Is this something that you're like, oh, I probably should talk about this? Or is this like a fire that's shut up in your bones? Is this something that you keep coming back to because it is on your heart? Or is this something that you're like, oh, it'd be nice to talk about? Is this something your congregation needs to hear? I am super passionate about creation care. And so I preach about that all the time. But I would really love it if we didn't have a flag in our sanctuary too. But that is much lower on my list of priorities. It's not a deal breaker. Also here, if we have time and you want to, we can have a much longer conversation about virtue signaling, about saying what you think should be said. But I'll just say for now that every congregation is different and we move forward at different speeds and congregations need to hear different things. They're in different places. And so there's really, I don't know if there's anything that everyone should say. All right, so if you're still not sure what to do, you can do a reverse analysis. So instead of saying, what are the risks of preaching this sermon and what are the benefits, you can say, what are the risks of not preaching this message and what are the benefits? And this puts it in a whole new perspective because the risks of not preaching sermons that help people to grow are what we're seeing in the church now. We're seeing churches that are shrinking, churches that feel irrelevant. And right now, if you're thinking it's really hard to preach anything that's like even slightly uncomfortable in my congregation, it's because in the past, pastors avoided preaching anything. And so things that you do now set you up to preach riskier sermons in the future, right? But the benefit of not preaching a risky sermon could mean that your congregation can grow in a different way or focus on a different path. So you know your congregation best, but this is just another way to look at things. So in classes now in the finance world, there would be a formula and you would have exact values to plug into the formula and you'd get to the end and be like, here's my answer. I've showed my work. I really wish that I had a formula to just give you here, but it doesn't work that way. So you can use some of the same principles. So after you've done this analysis, pray on it. Pray for insight. Pray for insight about yourself and about your congregation. Ask, is God really calling me to say something? Is my heart set on this? And then you can remember your options. So after your analysis, if it really feels too risky, or unlikely to make a difference, or not something that you particularly care about, you can walk away for now. It's okay. You don't have to preach every single risky sermon. So I know there's, for example, at my church, there's a lot of people who are anti-abortion. I am not. I would love to preach about how our faith calls to care for women and the unborn by offering free birth control and a more robust social safety net, including reproductive care. But one of the people who that would anger is my musician. And it is impossible up here to find another one. I have tried. So it's not something I feel especially called to talk about. And so I'll avoid that sermon. This is a point to also mention, make sure you avoid any explicitly partisan messages. I'm not saying avoid politics, but you're not up there to stump for a particular political party. And there isn't a political party that's perfectly aligned with God's teachings. So just remember, it's not your job to campaign. But here, as we are talking about avoiding, make sure you notice if avoid is the option that you choose the most often. While it might be safest not to take any risks, in the long run, being comfortable will not end well. So preaching risky sermons isn't really a matter of can we push or should we push, but really a question of how much should we push and how often. So now, if you've decided I'm not going to avoid it, I'm going to go for it. Now you can decide I'm going to mitigate. I'm going to try to lessen the risk that something bad will happen. So first, maybe take some baby steps. Also, I should say, I've got a lot of suggestions here. You do not have to follow all of them. That's a lot. But these are just suggestions, so take them as you will. So first, maybe take some baby steps. If you've never said anything close to what you're about to say, think about starting small. Maybe lay some groundwork in a few other sermons before you get to what you're really saying. So it's taken a couple sermons talking about God's love for the LGBTQIA+ community before I preached a sermon that went to Sodom and Gomorrah and talked about how this isn't actually about what we think it's about or what society says it's about. Let's trace this whole thing. And that was less risky because I had talked about it before. Use personal experience. That's me and my sister. We're hiking, not climbing. It's a little different. But you have not always been the pastor that you are now. So what led to your decision-making process? How have you changed your mind? And something that is really compelling is how are you falling short and how can you do better? Those are always really good examples. Know your pitfalls. For example, when I was in Florida teaching about climate change, there were people who got mad when I said the words climate change. And so when I wanted to preach about how God calls us to love everything that God has made, I talked about creation care. And so I could basically preach the same thing, but preaching about creation care doesn't set off a whole bunch of people. So knowing how to just kind of edge around some of the things that'll really take you down is helpful. Communicate. So change is scary. If you give more information about what is happening and why, it'll give people a little stability to hang on to. And so maybe put a little thing in the newsletter. Maybe have a book study, something that's able to give people even more information about how you've arrived at what you're preaching about. Know who's got your back. So it's really helpful to know who your supporters are and who might agree with you already, so you can run some ideas by them. It's also really helpful. It's a little hard right now, but if you know when you're up there in the pulpit who you can look at, who will be like, like you know who those people are who are gonna like nod in agreement with you. And that can help you get a little bit of courage. Be open to criticism. You are not always right. Sometimes I have to look in the mirror and tell myself, like, you are not always right. And then I say, I know everything, right? We are not always right. And there are times when you will make a wrong move, or you'll say the wrong thing, or you'll say the right thing, but in the wrong way. If you have kind of a policy or an aura that people can come tell you, and you'll take it into account and apologize and make sure that they know that they can come with these things to you, then it's more likely that they will come talk to your face about it instead of behind your back. Make concessions. If you know people are going to disagree with you, you can try to be considerate of them in other areas. So for example, when I wanted to preach on a Veterans Day, I wanted to have a peace Sunday that called for no more war. And so at the beginning of the sermon, or the beginning of the service, I had all of the veterans stand up so we could recognize them and applaud for them. And so it ensured that people knew before we started that I wasn't anti-veteran or anti-service people. Create areas for dialogue. So if you're preaching about something that is really contentious or could maybe use some more discussion, then creating additional spaces for people to interact and process is really helpful. So when we started talking about race this summer, I also started a book group. So now we're reading Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And that gives an additional space. And then it also helps you be able to build for later sermons. Do it well. When you've gone through the whole process of discovering what the risks are and deciding that the benefit's worth it, even though there's going to be some fallout, do yourself a favor and make sure you preach a good sermon. So then it's one less thing that you have to worry about. If that means waiting a little bit, that's okay. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd this summer, I didn't preach about racism that first Sunday after it happened. I waited 2 weeks, and then I was able to be much more confident. And then I was able in my sermon to say, you know, Black Lives Matter, because the rest of the sermon I felt was really strong and backed up what I was saying. So it's okay to wait a little bit. And then of course, pray. There's a lot of praying involved in this. So you want to pray that you can be courageous, and you would pray that your congregation has an open mind, and you would pray that everyone is hearing what God is saying to the church. So finally, whether you've decided to mitigate or not, if you're not avoiding risk, then you're going to bear the risk. And even with mitigation, it's not going to eliminate all of the fallout. People will get mad. People may leave. People may be mean. So it really helps to bear risk if you have solid boundaries, thick skin, and a good therapist. Are things I have discovered. Those are really helpful. And also remember what your benefit is. What are you doing this for? Why have you decided to bear this risk? And you've decided, hopefully, because you know that it's worth it. Remember also that no one chooses perfectly. There will be risks that you take that you shouldn't have. And the more risks you take, the more you learn about them. So for example, this isn't a sermon, but my first Veterans Day, someone brought flowers to put on the altar that had a flag in them. And me being, you know, a baby pastor was like, a flag on the altar, oh no. And I was like, I will die on this hill. So I took it out, I put it in the sacristy, and thought like, the matter is settled. And then later during coffee hour, everyone was talking about it. But of course, nobody would say it to my face. So that's one of those things now I can say, that wasn't that big of a deal. That would have been fine. So you live and you learn. On the other hand, there will be times you would wished you had acted more courageously. So this summer, for example, I waited so long to say anything about race. And I wish I'd been laying the groundwork in my sermons for the 2 years that I had been here, so that this summer I could have built on something instead of starting from scratch in a really contentious time. But we continue to learn. And you remember that no matter what's happened in the past, that now is always a good time to start. So just a note, check in with yourself too, if this is the one that you always pick, especially if you're choosing not to mitigate any of the risk. It is really important to be truth tellers, but also your congregation is bearing some of these risks with you. And so your congregation is more likely to be willing to bear risks if you give them a break every so often. All right, so now I've got a blessing for the end, but now I've got time for conversation and for any questions that we've got.
So friends, I think that, and Bridget, thank you. This is chock full of information. And I already know that one of the questions that's likely sitting in my inbox right now in email is people are saying, can we have access to her PowerPoint? So if you
Yes.
if you would give us access to anything, especially the list of risk assessment, I think was just really fascinating. And this is something that people will that just weren't able to show up live will want to have access to. So that's one question that I have. And I think that it would be lovely for us to field a few questions as a large group, but we also would like to give a little bit of time to break out into small groups and then hold your blessing to come back at the end, maybe at about 5 till. How does that sound? Okay, all right. Great. So friends, as long as we can keep it civil and give everyone turns to unmute and ask their questions, why don't we give 5 minutes or so to that, and then we can go to small groups.
Bridget, one of the things that my pastor in the church I grew up in taught me is that if you really have cared for your people, you've been with them in their crises, and they know that you love them, they tolerate a great deal of tension from the pulpit. Is that your experience?
Yeah, it's also a hard one because, I'm in my first 2 years of ministry. And so that I think that definitely is true, but I think it's really hard for people who have just started new calls to hear that and think like, do I have to wait till I've been here 10 years before I say anything? And so, yes, I think that's absolutely right. When people know that you love them, they can hear things that maybe they wouldn't be able to hear if they're not sure. And so, yeah, it's definitely a balance here of being able to say, maybe I haven't been here very long, but they're just going to have to learn to trust me as we go along.
Thank you.
Bridget, if you don't mind, there are some questions from the chat. So I'm going to read those one at a time to you. What is virtue signaling?
Yes, so virtue signaling is, it happens maybe a little bit more with younger people, but it's this idea of like, there is the right thing to say, and you're gonna do the right thing. And if you don't do that, then then you've missed out. You're not a good person. And so it's, so for example, in my congregation, virtue signaling might be to have said, make sure I say, Black Lives Matter, and maybe get a sign outside that says like Black Lives Matter, but then do no work with my congregation to make sure that we're actually being involved in anti-racism. So instead of actually doing the hard work of bringing a congregation with you to say, here's how we're going to be transformed by the word of God, it would be me being like, we're going to put a sign that says we're doing the right thing. So it's really kind of an empty gesture.
Thank you. Next question. How have you been laying the groundwork for the aftermath of this election?
That is a good question. Yes. So I think recently talking about, sometimes the text will really help you here. So recently we had the text about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And so being able to talk about there that no matter, that it doesn't matter who's in charge of the country, we know that God is in charge of us, right? And so being able to say there like, hey, what is God calling us to, no matter who wins this election? But then also being able to say, what is God calling us to? What does it mean that God is in charge of us? And it means working for justice, and it means working for peace in the world. And not just an empty peace that's just lack of conflict, but peace that looks like justice.
Maybe one more before breakout rooms. How do you employ the strategy of running things by others before preaching it?
Yes. So our church's secretary is amazing. And so it's really helpful for me to just go in and be like, hey, you've been here so long, you know these people so well. How is this going to go over? And she can tell me like, oh, well, 20 years ago, this happened. And so I think people really remember that. And so maybe that's not going to work very well. And so finding those like nice old ladies who've just been there for a really long time. Everyone kind of likes them, they're related to lots of people, or they've kind of got their finger on the congregation. And they're going to know more than you do. So figuring out who's kind of an ally that you can just say, what if I said this? Or how do you think people would react to this? Is really helpful.
Thank you. We're ready for breakout rooms then? Awesome. We don't have any set questions today, so if you want to just sort of unpack with each other a little bit, and then there is the one, what's your next most faithful step with what you have learned today? We'll see you all in a bit. And I think we're all back.
Okay. Hi, friends. Welcome back to the room. So in the next 2 or 3 minutes, I would love to hear if you would like to share some of the themes that surfaced in your small group conversations. Of course, keeping the confidence of your small group partners. What are some themes?
Jill, we talked about relationship and authenticity and how that supports everything else.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Yeah. What else?
We talked about the guy I was talking to mentioned, it's important to remember that we're pastor to the whole congregation, and that even if you know that there's going to be people that disagree with something you say, you still are called to be their pastor, and that can make it somewhat difficult. So one thing that was mentioned was, let me try something out. I'm not quite sure how y'all think about this, but let me try something kind of as a test. I thought that was an interesting suggestion, but yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, an important way of framing it. Yeah. What's another theme that surfaced in your conversations today?
To add to what Carol had said, preaching is always a risky business.
Right, Mukesh? Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things we talked about is ignored grief can become anger. And so really making room and helping people think about what they're grieving before it gets, to a boiling point, because it's much easier to deal with that than the anger. And coming up on election and coming up on whatever happens as many days after that we'll find out who's elected, there's going to be somebody grieving, somebody celebrating, but some space that needs to be given with just, okay, what's the loss? And now how do we deal with that so we don't find ourselves with a lot of conflict and anger that's harder to resolve? So wise words.
That's exactly the word that came to my mind, Janice. So much wisdom in that. And how do we create and hold that safe space where people can express the loss that they feel?
One of the things we briefly mentioned in the group I was in is our important role in helping people learn how to talk to people that they know disagree with them, and how to have a fruitful conversation. The church, I think, needs to model that for our whole society.
We have simply lost the art of civil discourse, John, and thank you for naming that out loud. It is our responsibility as the body of Christ to model this for society. Absolutely. And I think that God has given us some opportunity to grow into that potential in this time, because we don't always model that well. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, friends, as always, Tammy and I are going to hang on for another 30 minutes following our closing blessing for those that want to engage a little more deeply into this topic, and with some prayer together, some specific prayer time. And I just want to thank our guest speaker again, Bridget. This was so important, meaningful. Look at that applause. Yes, you've, one of the things that we were talking about is that in a time where I know personally, I'm hearing from a lot of pastors that feel very bullied, and having these tools to access is a way to stand up against that bullying and actually feel like you are taking some power, some appropriate and healthy power back in an equation and a situation in which you might be feeling bullied. So I'm very excited to share this with the rest of the leaders in our denomination. And friends, I also invite you to join us again next week as we will be talking the day after the election. Reverend Solveig will be back with us, bringing a topic of grief, and just to connect to what our dear friend Janice shared. There are many of us that will be feeling loss, no matter who ends up winning that election, and how can we as leaders start helping others process that grief in healthy ways. So join us again next week. Bridget, I invite you to help us end with a blessing.
All right, so now receive this blessing from Jan Richardson, a blessing of courage. I cannot say where it lives, only that it comes to the heart that is open, to the heart that asks, to the heart that does not turn away. It can take practice, days of tugging at what keeps us bound, seasons of pushing against what keeps our dreaming small. When it arrives, it might surprise you by how quiet it is, how it moves with such grace for possessing such power. But you will know it by the strength that rises from within you to meet it, by the release of the knot in the center of your chest that suddenly lets go. You will recognize it by how still your fear becomes as it loosens its grip, perhaps never quite leaving you, but calmly turning into joy as you enter the life that is finally your own. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bridget. Absolutely beautiful. God bless each of you. Thank you for joining us again today. I'm praying for each of you, and especially as we head into this upcoming challenging week. Yeah, I look forward to talking to you again soon.